everyone, welcome back to another Connecting Your Creativity. I'm Alex, and this week we'll be going over Watercolor 101. This will be helpful because in the next 4 weeks we will be doing watercolor tutorials, and this one we'll just go over the basics. All right, let's get started. So watercolor comes in a variety of different mediums, and what I mean by that is that they can come in these watercolor tubes, like these. They can come in watercolor palettes, like these that are already pre-caked. They can come in watercolor pencils, like we have here. Or you can go with gouache, which is an in-between of watercolor and acrylic. So gouache is really helpful because it's more opaque than watercolor, but it has the same flowy consistency as watercolor. These were all different and they have different uses. However, we will be focusing on watercolor cakes that come into your watercolor palette. However, I will still go over the different watercolor types. Next, we will be going over watercolor brushes. So typically speaking, watercolor brushes are usually round tip brushes, like this one. And this will give you better control of the water flow and can hold more water than flat brushes. That's why there is a difference between watercolor brushes and acrylic brushes, but they also come in flat tip brushes, like this one, similar to acrylic brushes. Again, this one will give you the best hold for your water, and it can spread on the paper and give nice petals if you're doing flowers. And you can have a variety of different sizes. So finer details might use a brush similar to this, where it's very small, and bigger details will go with the big round brush. Next, we'll be talking about watercolor paper. Both you and I will be using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. It is the most widely available watercolor paper. We also have hot press watercolor paper as well as rough press watercolor paper. The difference between the three is that cold press watercolor paper has an in-between rough and smoothness texture, which will hold and grip the pigments of your paint better, while still leaving a nice smooth finish. Hot press watercolor paper will just leave a smooth finish and might be a little bit more advanced to work with, since it cannot hold the pigment as tightly as rough or cold press watercolor paper would. Rough watercolor paper, again, will leave it has high ridges on the paper and will really attach to that pigment. However, it won't have a smooth finish like cold or hot press watercolor paper will. Next, we will be talking about colors. So each color palette, including yours, should have some basic colors. It should have a lemon yellow, some sort of deep or primary yellow, a sap green, a hooker's green, a primary blue, ultramarine, violet, crimson, primary red, or it might say like some sort of other red, and orange, burnt sienna, burnt umber, which is very important, black, and white. So let's watch a little bit of lemon yellow. Lemon yellow will have one of the lowest opacity rates. This is because it's a light color, and light colors usually tend not to cover so intensely. So we'll start at the bottom with the darkest or the most opaque yellow we can get. And the way that you do that is by having less water. So when you want to lighten the color, you just add more water to the color. We do not add white in watercolor because it will just make your paint more opaque instead of lightening a color. Whenever you want to lighten a color, again, you just want to get more water on your brush so that it ends up looking like this. So as we can see, it came out dark at the bottom and light at the top. So that's our first color. Next we have a deep yellow, which we can swatch here. And again, I'm gonna have a least bit of water at the beginning. And you always want to wipe off your brush in between each color. So each color you need to clean and wipe down your brush. All right, so as you can see here, that deep yellow is a little bit more warm tone than this lemon yellow. And that would be good for adding a little bit of warmth to, say, the middle of a flower. Next, we have sap green. So we're just going to take a little bit of sap green and go to the bottom with the most opaque that we can get the green. And then add a little bit of water and kind of fan it out. So here is what our sap green looks like. Again, that's more of like a yellow green. And we have our hooker's green here. And this is more of a blue green. So as you can see, this is a little bit more of a blue-green color. And then we have our primary blue. Primary blue, primary red, and perhaps even primary yellow or the lemon yellow are best for mixing when and we'll talk about mixing a little bit more down here. Perfect. As you can see, this is more of a true blue type of color. Now, ultramarine is going to be similar to this, except it is going to have a little bit of purple hue to it. So it's a little bit more on the cooler side, while primary blue is more like neutral colored. This one is a little bit more, cool toned. So think of the ocean. This is a good like oceany color. And as you can see, the darker the color, the least opaque, the more opaque this will be. Next we have violet, which is one of my favorite colors. And as you can see, it's a true violet color. It's pretty neutral, but still cool toned. Next we have crimson. and primary red. We have orange. We have burnt sienna, which is, I think, a lovely like orangey brown color. It's very similar. Then we have burnt umber, which is great for mixing colors and for leaves and twigs. It is a good true brown shade. I think it's a little bit on the cooler side, especially compared to the burnt sienna. And then we have our black. And we have white. Now, typically in watercolor, we don't use white, and I'm going to show you why. So as you can see, it didn't add any color, but it did make the writing opaque, so you can't see the writing anymore. We don't typically use white because it makes the colors foggy and a lot less legible. And for this reason, we usually leave black and white out of watercolor. However, art is very subjective. It's really up to you. If you would like to use black, go for it. Generally speaking, if I am going to use black, I add another color like blue, for example, as we can see here. And that kind of just makes it a more organic color. So instead of just straight black, it has this nice bluish tint. I can also add red, and that gives it a nice purpley blackish color. When you're mixing, you usually want to use a mixing palette like this. We typically, again, art is very subjective, it's really up to you. We don't want to take colors straight from the tube or the palette. Instead, we want to mix our paints so that they're not so bright and they're a lot more natural looking. As you can see here, a lot of these colors are very bright. They're not very muted, so to speak. And when you take straight colors like this, you end up getting things that look a little bit artificial, a little bit too vibrant. So, for example, if we want a nice green color, like this sap green here, I might take a little bit of that sap green right here, add a little bit of blue to it, and a little bit of burnt umber, this brown color, perhaps even a little bit of black. Like I said, we don't use it often, but we do use it to mix. And then I have a nice, beautiful shade of green that looks a lot different than our sap green up here and looks a little bit more realistic if I were to be doing leaves, for example. So that's like a nice, pretty green color. This can also be true for red. So again, this crimson right here, a little bit of the orange, and even a little bit of the violet mix together. And you just kind of go until you see a color that you think is pretty. And you just want to have a little bit of water on your brush. So that you can mix thoroughly, but not too much. And you'll find the right balance when you play with it a little. It shouldn't be super watery, but it should have a little bit of water in it. So I mixed a little bit of the green that we just came up with here, which is Hooker's green, a little bit of sap green, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and a little bit of burnt umber. I mixed some crimson, and I mixed a little bit of violet and a tad bit of orange, and now we have a color that kind of looks even like a dusty rose color to me. Like so. And it doesn't look as bright as the crimson over here, but it does have a nice warm shade to it. So you can see the colors over here and the colors that we mixed. When you're mixing colors, you want to have enough of the color so that you don't run out. So if you were doing lots of flowers and you know that you wanted to make 7 of the flowers the same color, you want to mix the color enough here because it's hard to go back and color match. It's a lot easier to make too much of the color that you want, and you can always save it and use it for later, which is the great thing about watercolor. I can close this, leave it overnight, unlike acrylic, which will dry and crack, and then I can open it the next morning, get it wet, and it'll reabsorb the water and really bring your paint back to life. So when you're making a color, you want to have enough so that you don't run out of that color, and it really stays consistent throughout your piece. Okay, next we're going to start with applications. There are two main different applications that you can use for watercolor. There is wet on wet and wet on dry. So wet on dry is like we did over here. When we take our color, for example, and we go straight on the paper like so. That is a wet on dry technique. Wet on dry is awesome for creating a beautiful gradient of color and for keeping the texture and just general detail. I would say wet on dry is the way to go. Now, wet on wet is very similar. However, before we even touch the paint, we're going to take our loaded watercolor brush with water, and we're going to wet the surface of our paper. Then we're going to go back in with our color of our choosing, and as you can see, it makes a nice pastel-y, cloudy type of situation. Also, you can tap the color like this, called blotting or blooming, and it will spread out and give you a nice, really cool texture like that. And it'll also let colors bleed into each other more. So the colors can bleed and flow a lot more easily. It's a lot more flowy of a technique versus this one, which is really good for details. This one I would say is best for backgrounds or for if you're doing a portrait, for example, to fill in the portrait's first layer. So next we can just go straight into techniques. So this is layering. So as you can see here, I have this one mostly dry, this leaf. And watercolor, the goal is to usually layer. You want to layer colors so that they get brighter, and you want to layer them so that they have more detail. So for example, this leaf here is pretty much already dry. And if I layer a little bit of brown on it, it gives it a little bit more depth. And I can even take a little bit of yellow and now it's not just a flat green piece. It has yellow and brown tinges of color in it. And you always want to layer and layer colors. So as you can see, this one is a little bit just kind of faded. As watercolor dries, it will dry much lighter than what you originally intend. So you want to layer those colors, and you want to make sure that your original drawing is completely dry before layering. So again, so for example, this one is getting a little bit too light. You just go in with a little bit more color and kind of ink it in where you think it should be. And just kind of darken up those areas. There's also pooling, which is very similar to this wet on wet technique. So to pool, you would do the same thing. Get it wet, take your color, and pool a whole area. It's pretty much the same as wet on wet, except now over it, when it dries, you can go in with a little bit more detail. Usually a wet to dry combination and not wet on wet, because if you already have a pigment down and try to get it wet, it will move the pigment on the paper. Lastly, we have dragging and lifting. So to drag is the same thing as pretty much wet on dry. You would drag a color down. And dragging is a good way to, it's pretty much the OG of watercolor. You want to drag most of the time. These ones were drags. And lifting is really cool because if you notice that you made a mistake or the color is just a little bit too dark or you want it to dry faster, you can go ahead and lift with watercolor like this. And it even creates a little bit of a texture, like so. And you can lift here as well. And it just kind of sucks up all of the pigment that you kind of put down and leaves a nice pastel-y color. So that's lifting. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Again, these are our colors and our techniques. We have wet on wet, wet on dry, and pooling and dragging, which these are these. And we learned a little bit about mixing colors. All of these techniques will come together in our next tutorial. Again, this is very abstract, and I understand that some of you might be confused on how these can be put into theory. We will go over that next week. We will be doing watercolor flowers, and I am very excited to kind of just put these into practice with you all, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I will see you next week for another Connecting Your Creativity. Bye!